Welcome, everyone, to the podcast, the Art Fisher podcast. I'm Reese Fisher.
And I'm Nolan Fisher.
And today we are very, very excited to be discussing A Brave New World and 1984. Both of these are dystopian novels.
Yeah, so I'll start by just briefly going over the general plot, sort of beat by beat points of A Brave New World, and then I think we'll probably just kind of go back and forth, Reese will lay out, the plot of 1984, and then we'll try to go over the themes and then get into a discussion of between the two of them, which one is more realistic, which one seems to be more accurate with what these were predicting, which ones we like better, the general cultural discussion and understanding of them, and so on. So I'll dig in here. Brave New World is a 1932 British dystopian novel. It's written by a guy named Aldous Huxley, who hopefully we can do an episode on one day. He's a wild and pretty interesting guy. But this dystopia is roughly 500 years in the future from where we are. I think it dates it. I don't remember, but I know it's like year 600 AF, which stands for after Ford, because in the society, people worship Henry Ford as well as Freud, Sigmund Freud. And there's a lot of discussion within the novel about how a lot of characters don't understand history, so they basically view Freud and Ford as being the same thing. But a lot of the fundamental aspects of Freud's psychoanalytical model and Henry Ford's assembly line management model are the basis of this society. So the novel starts off. This is a good way to introduce the whole thing. It's just the first opening paragraph of it. A squat gray building of only 34 stories. Over the main entrance, the words Central London Hatchery and Conditioning Center, and in a shield, the world state's motto, community, identity, and stability. The novel then launches into a pretty detailed explanation of how people are born in this world, which is through not precisely genetic engineering, but through these types of artificial wombs, which are meant to basically breed out selective personality traits and types of being, with the goal that when these babies are eventually born, they're then indoctrinated into a specific class system. So they have the caste system, they call it the class system. The reason I go into that explanation for it is because this book came out before they knew what DNA was. So it's not genetic engineering. Specifically, Huxley didn't know what genes were. So it's this really convoluted explanation, which kind of bogs down the beginning of the novel. Which I figured be worth a mention. But at any rate, then opens up to one of the protagonists of the novel, a guy named Bernard Marx, who is a psychologist who studies sleep learning. And basically, he is an undesirable guy. I think he's part of the middle class or one of the middle classes. He's not particularly... Actually, they go out of their way to say he's ugly, which nobody else cares about, but it gives him a huge inferiority complex, which sort of drives who he is as a person. So he hates the current government regime, which obviously, if they're able to socially engineer babies from birth, has a total and complete authoritative control over the populace. Which, in addition to engineering the babies from birth, they're also given a drug called soma constantly. So the entire populace of the world state is drugged up with some just happiness producing dopamine filled drug. And Bernard is like openly against this system of government. So he goes and he visits New Mexico with his love interest, a lady named Lenina. And while they're in New Mexico, they see a bunch of naturally born people who are like descendants of the Anasazi, like the Pueblo Native Americans. And to them, they're just savages. Like they don't understand their society at all. But when they're there visiting, they find a naturally born boy named John, who is the son of like an important woman, or not an important woman, an important man, like the director of the entire like baby engineering department, who left the wife and this son there during a trip. Um, and obviously it can never come out that it's his son because it would disgrace this guy, and they have some kind of like weird sophisticated um, cultural problems with having natural born children. Like there's an entire plot about these, what are they called, belts? They're like Malthusian belts. Yeah, it's like a contraceptive belt worn by women in the world so that they don't have natural born children. But at any rate, they meet this kid who ends up becoming like the most important part of the novel. But this kid is completely ostracized from this Native American society. And his only real connection with like understanding his own feelings, because he doesn't have any social interaction, is he only has Shakespearean books. So he often quotes Shakespeare throughout this part and the next part of the novel. So basically, Bernard takes this kid and his mom back to London, where John immediately becomes like a celebrity because people think that he's just like this really funny guy who has no conception of culture, but he's like well read and has all these hilarious Shakespeare quotes he says all the time. His mom ends up addicted to the soma stuff and basically disappears from the novel, other than to occasionally show back up and die. Um, and there's this entire plot about something called death conditioning, where people are not supposed to be upset about death. In fact, I think they actually say like that's not the correct way to deal with death. But basically, when John's mom dies, it causes a bunch of riots because he's openly upset about the death, and they have to quell all of these riots by like spraying the soma drug like all over the rioting people, which just works immediately at stopping them. Bernard and John are brought before like the a resident world controller for the entire world state, and basically Bernard and one of his other friends are going to be exiled forever because what they did was not in line with the society. And Bernard pleads for a second chance, but is basically told to go fuck himself. John, yeah, they have like a really philosophical conversation about the nature of the society and what's right and what's wrong with governing. And basically, John rejects the Mustafa guy, who's the controller, rejects all of his ideas, and decides to like stop being a celebrity. So he goes and like lives in this lighthouse for the end of the novel, and he basically just lives up on this hill in a lighthouse, like flogging himself every day, like just whipping himself, and that makes him a bigger celebrity. And so a bunch of people come out to constantly visit him, and this makes him even angrier and angrier because he doesn't want to be a celebrity. And finally, like they just bring hordes and hordes of people out to his lighthouse in helicopters, and he whips them up into a frenzy because beats a woman who came there to fuck him, and that makes everyone there really happy. And then they all have a huge drug fueled orgy. And then in the morning, John hangs himself. And that is the general plot of A Brave New World.
All right. I'm gonna try try to match that. I'd also like to say this episode is not meant as an argument. So Nolan is not necessarily arguing for A Brave New World, and I'm not necessarily arguing for 1984. Yeah, I think you're a little bit more familiar with that, with A Brave New World than I am, and I'm a little bit more familiar with 1984 than you. So 1980.
Yeah, you say that, but I think it will become an argument.
Yeah, that was kind of why I said that now. It's designed to not be an argument, but yeah, we probably will be kicking and screaming by the end. All right. I'd also like to preface this by saying I've taught this book 4 times, 1984, the last 4 years. So hopefully I am able to back this up or do it justice. Any of my students that are listening, oh my, the test is on, I guess. So 1984 is a dystopian novel. It was published June 8th of 1949, and it is set also in London. It is set in formerly Great Britain, which is known in the story as Airstrip 1, which is a province of Oceania, and that is run by the party, which is the government, and their figurehead / leader, Big Brother. And I will also read the first part of the book here. It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. Winston Smith, his chin nuzzled into his breast in an effort to escape the vile wind, slipped quickly through the glass doors of Victory Mansions, though not quickly enough to prevent a swirl of gritty dust from entering along with him. The hallway smelt of boiled cabbage and old rag mats. At one end of it, a colored poster too large for indoor display had been tacked to the wall. It depicted simply an enormous face, more than a meter wide, the face of a man of about 45 with a heavy black mustache and ruggedly handsome features. Winston made for the stairs. It was no use trying the lift. Even at the best of times, it was seldom working, and at present the electric current was cut off during daylight hours. It was part of the economy drive in preparation for Hate Week. The flat was 7 flights up, and Winston, who was 39 and had a varicose ulcer above his right ankle, went slowly, resting several times on the way. On each landing, opposite the lift shaft, the poster with the enormous face gazed from the wall. It was one of those pictures which are so contrived that the eyes follow you about when you move. Big Brother is watching you, the caption beneath it ran. So this story follows the unassuming main character, Winston Smith, who works for one of the government's 4 ministries, the Ministry of Truth. And his job is what is referred to as historical negationism, which is the altering of history. And it is asserted pretty early on that he actually hates the government, the party, which is the only party in the story, and begins rebelling basically by writing in a diary, which is quote unquote illegal. He rebels further throughout the story by basically this woman that he works with in the ministry sort of falls in front of him, and there is a camera there, and he kind of like helps her up, and she gives him a note that says, "I love you." And then they decide to meet up in the woods, and they have a really fun session of physical intimacy in the woods. And so he and Julia is her name. She's referred to as the girl with dark hair up until her name, Julia. They rebel further above a shopkeeper's shop. His name is Mr. Charrington, and he is in the Prole district. and the proles are the proletariat, and they are like 85% of the population of Oceania. And so Mr. Charrington's shop is in that district where Julia and Winston make sweet love and have the ability to escape Big Brother's watchful eye, or so they think. And so they rebel against Big Brother and the party through their love, through their sex. Winston also joins O'Brien and the Brotherhood. The Brotherhood is this underground rebellious organization that plans clandestine activities somehow or other, and he rebels and means to rebel through this organization. Eventually, unfortunately for Winston and Julia, they are betrayed by Mr. Charrington, who turns out to be part of the Thought Police, which is the party's police arm. And he is then betrayed further by O'Brien. And his human side basically needs to rebel. He is labeled as a quote-unquote special case by O'Brien and is basically tortured mercilessly in the Ministry of Love until he is essentially broken. He wants to love the party and he wants to love Big Brother, but it's not enough just to love the party and love Big Brother. You have to be broken down and then rebuilt back up, which happens at the end of the story. He is reintroduced to society, and the last part of the story, he loves Big Brother. The only last thing that I would add is that this is written by Eric Arthur Blair, otherwise known as George Orwell, who was born in 1903 and he died in 1950. So this book was released a year before he died.
All right, yeah. So where do you want to go now?
I think you should probably mention like the big ideas that are explored in A Brave New World, and then I will mention the ones that I have, which are a ton from 1984, and then we can sort of like go between them, cross between them in some capacity.
I would argue or describe as the book's basically main character describes that there is a right to be unhappy. And that ends up being sort of the defining feature of Bernard, but more so John's rebellion against the world state and its oppressive system. And it's kind of the underlying element for like what type of people would or wouldn't be able to survive in this environment. Beyond that, there's a lot of themes throughout it. Some of them are rooted in history, some of them are just more rooted in like pure science fiction. Obviously, there's a ton of stuff about Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud, both famous like psychoanalysts, psychologists from well before we even had anything related. They're kind of like the creators of modern psychology, which nowadays has been moved away from. There's a lot of thematic work with similarities between the John character and characters from Shakespeare's plays, and the book seems to just implicitly find there to be meaning and importance from Shakespeare. So the book ends up being very anti-censorship, because censorship is a big, like the people, it's not necessarily that they're not allowed to read the way that they are in 1984. It's more so that they just choose not to. Like everyone in this society is on Soma. I don't really know how to put that into words, like the society-wide addiction to this drug. it's kind of ironic, like the way that they're all addicted to it and the way that even the leaders of the society use it. But um, I think that about sums it up. Like it kind of like the book is definitely meant to be predictive of the future, and it foresees a future in which people will be more laissez-faire. They're not going to care as much about what the governments are up to. They're just going to be hedonistic, uncaring about relationships with one person. They're going to be in large, free flowing relationships with many people. Sexuality is a free thing. It doesn't really matter. Everybody can fuck whoever they want. Um, People should take all the drugs they want. It doesn't matter what they do anyway, so they should just be happy. Um, and despite that, the one freest character of all is considered a celebrity, and everyone loves him for, speaking out and acting the wrong way, but it still just kills him. I don't know. I guess John's journey into death is like ultimately a metaphor. Like he like is doing the self-flagellation for like the last 20% of the book. Like a huge part of the book is dedicated to him just whipping himself. And it kind of drags home this point about how the process of like individuation and becoming the individual and having individuality is a painful process and kind of requires you to hurt yourself and go against culture and against society, even though society has this inherently good view of those who are individuals. Those individuals still seem to be consumed by their inability to fit in.
Sorry, I'm writing most of this down just so I can keep track of it. Great. My big ideas are I literally just have a piece of paper with all of the big ideas or thoughts that are from this story. So, totalitarianism, one of the most popular themes asserted, or the easiest one to understand, is that the dangers of totalitarianism. The name of the book is 1984, which is meant as a warning about and sort of gives an immediacy, I guess, of the dangers of totalitarianism, given this came out in 1949. So yeah, it just kind of put like a stopwatch on things and was like, hey, we shouldn't have this happen in 1984. That's one of the biggest themes, is that the rest of these are not themes. They're more so just big ideas and explorations of ideologies, love, sex, free will, societal complacency, the proletariat, slaves and drones of one's own will, the limiting of speech with censorship, satire, a perpetual war, historical negationism, doublethink, the theory and practice of oligarchical collectivism, which is Goldstein's book, dehumanization, control of information, memory hole, technological manipulation, pain and suffering, betraying of others is the betraying of oneself, 2 + 2 = 5, distracted by entertainment and alcohol, black and white thinking versus independent thought. Chess is referenced numerous times. The lens of power. And I have on here also that in our world, so to connect to our world, at least one of the biggest ideas that I think people miss nowadays is that our phone and our relationship with our phone is like this weird interplay between multiple big brothers, where we are our own big brother, and then the phone is big brother, and then the things we see on our phone are another big brother. So it's like there are 3 big brothers that are constantly in this like feedback loop, um, which is further highlighted from the documentary The Social Dilemma, which is actually something that I typically show in class after reading 1984. Yeah. So, one other thing I wanted to mention before we get into things, Nolan, is George Orwell was he was writing about various other authors at the time, or authors who came before him, and he met Yevgeny Zemyatin, who published the dystopian novel We in 1924.
Yeah, I'm familiar.
And he also wrote an article for the Tribune titled Freedom and Happiness, where he basically discussed Aldous Huxley's A Brave New World as well as Yevgeny Zemyatin's We. And after sort of writing this article, he set out to write 1984, and this was after he had already achieved what you might call critical and commercial success from Animal Farm. So we have a lot on our plate.
Yeah, I'll address that part because it's been, I mean, comparing these two has already been done thousands of times. So whatever I hope to gain from will probably be in our disagreements of it, rather than like a, hardcore analysis of one versus the other, or one and the other and their similarities. But sort of before we get into that, there's been lots of like allegation of plagiarism on both sides, from people either going like, oh, well, 1984 is just a worse Brave New World, or people who prefer 1984, dislike both, discount that A Brave New World is just a plagiarized version of We. Like there's lots of people who just assume, including Zemyatin himself, who just believed that Huxley ripped off We, even though Huxley claimed not to have. But for whatever it's worth, for who ripped off who, where the ideas came from, like both of these novels are really enduring, and both are clearly written by great authors. And where the idea is necessarily generated, I don't find to be that interesting. Philosophically, the books are still very unique. They offer a unique portrait of two very different predictions of the future, even at two very different times. It's odd to think about Huxley writing this between World War I and World War II, versus Orwell having lived through World War II and then writing his vision. It actually kind of makes some sense that Huxley would come away with it and be like, no, the future is a dark, evil place. I want to... this is kind of a long quote, but I think it's a good place to start with, like, comparing these two books. It's a quote by a social critic and journalist named Neil Postman, who wrote a book in the 80s called Amusing Ourselves to Death, which starts by analyzing the two books and sort of comparing them. But this is like the foreword to his book, which summarizes a lot of his points. He writes, "What Orwell feared were those who would ban books. What Huxley feared was that there would be no reason to ban a book, for there would be no one who wanted to read one. Orwell feared those who would deprive us of information. Huxley feared those who would give us so much that it would be reduced to passivity and egoism. Orwell feared that the truth would be concealed from us, where Huxley feared that the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. Orwell feared we would become a captive culture. Huxley feared that we'd become a trivial culture, preoccupied with some equivalent of the feelies, the orgy-porgy, and the centrifugal bumble-puppy," which are obviously concepts from the book. As Huxley remarked in A Brave New World Revisited, the The civil libertarians and rationalists who are ever on the alert to oppose tyranny, quote, failed to take into account man's almost infinite appetite for distractions. In 1984, Huxley added, people are controlled by inflicting pain. In Brave New World, they are controlled by inflicting pleasure. In short, Orwell feared that what we hate will ruin us. Huxley feared that what we love will ruin us. So I don't know how much of that you necessarily agree with. It's funny to read that after what you were saying about like thinking in black and white and just taking others' thoughts rather than developing your own, and then reading this guy's opinion of the two books where he like very clearly delineates them as being black and white thought, having very little overlap.
Yeah,
because I don't necessarily find everything that he said there to be completely accurate, but I generally agree with the sentiment. I think
I like most of what he said. The very last bit is obviously written more for a nice forward to a book, which is typically very general and tries to sound sort of poetic and nice and neat. In short, Orwell feared that what we hate will ruin us. I think that's an inaccurate portrayal of what 1984 is.
Yeah, same.
And Huxley feared that what we love will ruin us. I think that is more accurate. This book is about the possibility that Huxley, not Orwell, was right. That's great. Yeah. I mean, I haven't read Amusing Ourselves to Death, but I certainly...
It's a great Roger Water album.
Speaking of Pink Floyd episode, yeah. I certainly think that Huxley's Amusing Ourselves to Death, that ethic from this book is more relevant to okay, we'll get to that then. Just give me like a minute. I think that ethic is more relevant to like our current world, and also like our generation and the generation behind us. Actually, even worse, our parents' generation. So just humans. So yeah, I mean, amusing ourselves to death, like the infinite distractions that we have, the toys we keep coming up with, the way people talk about those toys as well. Like most of the time is spent talking about shit we want, shit we need, or shit we think we want or need. And it's just like, oh, well, what's the new thing you got? What's the new thing I want? Oh, I've always wanted to get this. I'm thinking about getting this. Yeah, that's what I have to say. We'll be right back. And we are back. So,
howdy.
I also think that from Postman's quote, I think he does a decent job in this forward of just identifying that like both of these books, while they are warnings for the future, they, as we are discussing this in 2023, have come true to some extent. And maybe along the way of this episode, we can talk about the extent to which they have come true and the extent to which we are concerned that they will continue to become even more true. And yeah, I don't want to sound like I'm putting on a tinfoil hat here. I try not to when I'm teaching the book, because otherwise the students turn off to it. But the book kind of teaches itself. 1984, like they read it and they get it. Like they understand how scary it can be. It doesn't take a lot from my teaching to freak them out about it. Yeah, that's all the more I really have to say about Postman's quote.
Yeah. Let me read this Christopher Hitchens quote next then, because it's kind of it's like a more comprehensive version of what Postman wrote. Christopher Hitchens was a journalist and cultural critic, social critic guy. But but he wrote an article called Why Americans Are Not Taught History. This is an excerpt from it. We dwell in a present tense culture that somehow significantly decided to employ the telling expression your history, spelled UR, as a choice, reprobation, or insult, and thus elected to speak forgotten volumes about itself. By that standard, the forbidding dystopia of George Orwell's 1984 already belongs, both as a text and as a date, with and Mycenae, while the hedonist nihilism of Huxley still beckons towards a painless, amusement-sodden, and stress-free consensus. Orwell's was a house of horrors. He seemed to strain credulity because he posited a regime that would go to any lengths to own and possess history, to rewrite and construct it, and to inculcate it by means of coercion. Whereas Huxley rightly foresaw that any such regime could break because it could not bend. In 1988, 4 years after 1984, the Soviet Union scrapped its official history curriculum and announced that a new authorized version was somewhere in the works. This was the precise moment when the regime conceded its own extinction. For true, blissed out, and vacant servitude, though, you need an otherwise sophisticated society where no serious history is taught. So this quote still sort of suffers from the same thing where he criticizes Orwell by saying, Orwell's was a house of horrors. That is vaguely more accurate because he's not making the blanket statement of Orwell feared that hate will ruin us. Because 1984 is a more horrific novel in the sense that there's that long period of torture. But yeah, what do you think of?
I do much better to read the quote, so I agree with it more, I would say, than Postman's. One thing I will say about like it being a house of horrors is I just think that doesn't give it as much credit. That's like me talking to a student who is just like, well, the wheelbarrow is red. It's a red wheelbarrow. And I'm like, okay, but there's other stuff happening in there besides the red wheelbarrow. Like you could think outside of, obviously the red wheelbarrow is a poor example. It's a famous poem, but my point is that like what literally is happening is there's a lot more happening under the surface, and like the connections between the characters, what they might mean, the manipulation of people, their thoughts, restriction of their thoughts. I don't think is quite as explored as most critics think they've explored it. Like they kind of just write it off as this thing of mass surveillance and a dictatorship, but it's well thought out in its execution of that. And the proles, I think, also are largely left out of people's critiques of this story, and they play a hugely foundational and pivotal role within the story. And actually, because they don't play a pivotal role in the overthrowing of the government, that's kind of like one of the points of the story. And it's a point of emphasis that they can't and are incapable of it because they're so distracted by entertainment and alcohol that they don't. Like, the government doesn't monitor them. The government doesn't have to. The party doesn't monitor them, or if they do, they don't really like care about the proles because they aren't going to overthrow them. And they also don't really know about history, and the history they do know about is already altered. So it doesn't really matter for them. Like they're so poor that they only care about their day-to-day lives, which is currently what's happening in our world today. And they're 85% of the population. Sound familiar?
Yeah, ultimately, I think Huxley is more right in describing Western civilization's movement towards this type of dystopia. But Orwell's not like wholesale wrong. Like huge chunks of what he thought would happen functionally have happened. They've just played out quite differently.
I
Like,
see I see Huxley. I'm so sorry for cutting you off. Um, I see Huxley as being more literally right, and I see Orwell as being more like I don't want to say philosophically right, but the echoes of his philosophical dangers are going to continue.
Yeah, yeah. So that's what I agree with that. Like I think Huxley was right to put a lot of blame on the individual in terms of like we're animals, and so if you can give us a drug that makes us hallucinate and feel good, then like we're going to take that drug all the time. Obviously we don't have soma, like there's not a fucking mescaline pandemic, but or epidemic rather. um but
Alcohol.
but yeah, alcohol consumption is on the rise and has been higher than it's been in a long time. Hard drug use is at a dangerously high level at the moment. America's going through an opiate addictive crisis. Like, uh, the Western world has some problems with drugs and alcohol for sure. Um, but yeah, like to say that Orwell got that wrong is to, like you said, discount the entire part about the proles and how like they don't care what happens because they have just enough to make their lives a little less miserable.
Yeah, and that's like the whole point of the proles that most people don't even discuss because it doesn't really, it's not really mentioned all that much, but it is something that I think Orwell fleshed out but didn't go into great detail, and you have to sort of add it up yourself, but that's what it adds up to be. And yeah, I mean, I do think that people are medicating themselves to death or distracting themselves to death either through self medication, or a doctor prescribing something, as well as just consuming alcohol. Well, life is stressful. The world appears to be shitty. Oh, the news is telling me the world is turning to shit. Time to just turn my brain off by consuming copious amounts of liquid and then just watching Love Island on Netflix. Why wouldn't I just do that? And then months pass, years pass, things are changing, but then you're left feeling just completely devoid of anything. And we wonder why.
There is something to be said about the idea that Orwell was less trying to predict the future and more trying to tell a cautionary tale. Um, because like what he was most concerned with was socialism turning into communism, and therefore socialism finding root in democracy. Because I think that's something he strongly believed in, was democracy was like the last bastion to stop authoritarianism from rising out of something like socialism, because he was a huge critic of socialism because he had seen a lot of socialist countries turn and become authoritarian regimes. Um, I mean, it's like the proles in his book are like nearly identical to multiple periods of time in real life Russian history before and after he wrote 1984. Like that was just the thing that happened continuously, was that Russia was able to mass produce large quantities of alcohol, which seemingly satisfied the completely uneducated and unaware proletariat class in Russian history. From like the basically from the like feudal period back in the like 15th century and 16th century, before there was even like a greater Russian Empire, up through the fall of the Russian Empire, the beginning of the Soviet Union, and then the same thing plagued the Soviets, mainly because they've always had a lot of trouble with feeding a large population of people from a centralized planned economy. Um, I know that was long winded, but what I was going to add on top of that is like if Orwell is describing this as like this is a state of being we should avoid at all costs, and there are markers of what lead us there, and those markers are his like 2+2=5, double think, um,
News
thought
speak.
police, like yeah, news speak, like self censorship, mass surveillance. Like these are all things that will probably inevitably lead to authoritarianism. Whereas that's where I find there to be the difference between these novels is like Orwell's saying these things, the warning, like these things are going to lead us down this path, whereas Huxley is like, no, 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 this is an inevitability because people will always be in power and those below them will always seek what makes them feel best. And so at some point, they'll figure out how to weaponize that against us.
Yeah, and I mean, it is one of those things that it sounds trite to say, but not because it's in Spanish, but porque no los dos. Like, why wouldn't it just be some version in between both of these stories? Or if you just took an amalgamation of a number of some of the best dystopias, uh, Fahrenheit 451 comes to mind, but that focuses a little too literally on the burning of books. But like, there's something that is crossing between them, but I think both of these stories are very important because they are very different in the government's execution and control. And I think the world that we live in right now is not between those worlds, but I think the world that we are going to become is a combination of both.
I just think we're already there.
We're already in a brave new world.
I think, yeah, minus the genetic uh, artificial womb part. But we definitely live in a time where there's like basically just class based propaganda that you're taught from birth to stay in the same class. Or just like the American dream lie that you get told so that you can try to ascend the class ladder, because technically the only thing that stops you from changing classes, at least in the West, is your ability to maintain wealth and create capital. But separate from all of that, I think we already are in a brave new world in terms of like just our passivity, like our willingness to just consume endlessly, to be passive. Because the thing we haven't mentioned, which I think is a much stronger drug than like the drugs that people are addicted to, is the one that way more people are addicted to, which is TV. Like, while the rates of alcohol consumption or drug abuse and all of that may be on the rise and may be startling, and we have a lot of opiate deaths like heroin deaths or fentanyl overdoses, like people are way more addicted to the TV. They're way more addicted to their phone, like what type of content you're putting in. And so I think we're in that sense, we're already taking in the soma. And the difference is the Orwellian nightmare part is how we get messed with to convince us that, the opposing ideology we might have is the real fear. So like all of, like we're already basically all thought police for each other, but for our own ideology.
Yes, that makes sense. Another scary feature going with the thought police part is that children in 1984's world are also basically brainwashed by the government, but also their parents, to spy on their parents and report them to the government if they say anything bad about Big Brother or the party. So like, kids are telling on their parents, they're snitching, they're little snitches. And also their parents are largely in loveless relationships because they're chosen to be together by the government, because sex is bad, because it's a form of freedom. So you basically, you basically are selected to be with someone else that you probably don't like.
Yeah, and I view like God, just analyzing the like psychosexual behavior of Americans is like pretty telling of that. Like you have very repressed class of people from like basically Gen X upward, where it's not really something that they want to talk about or need to talk about. It's just like, no, 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 that's private, that's religion. You just don't talk about that kind of thing. Um, and that is a sort of problem that led to decades of unneeded homophobia and sexual repression, which probably burst out in weird ways, creating a lot of pedophiles and angry men who went on to kill people. But in contrast to that, you then have millennials and Gen Z who are far more sexually open. They're more willing to be in open relationships. They're more willing to be in polyamorous relationships. They're more willing to do what would have been considered 100 years ago like illegal, like sexually deviant, horrible things. Um, so they're more open, but ironically, they're having way less children and they're just having way less sex. So it's like this inverse where the boomers were, they just fucked like rabbits and produced a bunch of people. And now we have people who are open, but they don't want to. And I think that all drives from the same place. Like I think that is a convergence of Huxley and Orwell's ideas. Like Huxley was right that we would be like hedonist and nihilistic in a weird way, but then like that openness, I think he was right about, at least in describing what the like people under 40, people under 50 now think like. But then they have an Orwellian view of actually being in relationships. That is just, with no comment on the way that COVID might have affected this, or the way in general that people have viewed the institution of marriage or the idea of having children in a world that they see as going in the wrong direction.
Yeah, I think you're sparking sort of connections that I'm seeing now. So the way that I see a Brave New World is that its control of the people is by giving them the ability to just perpetually give themselves pleasure. Like they're just supplying them with ways that they can just press the pleasure button over and over and over again. Whereas what is that? Whereas 1984, they're just like completely restricting them from all of that. So there is some external force that is constraining them, and so I think that we are in a brave new world to the extent that like we basically have the capability of just pleasuring ourselves constantly. Like obviously you need money in order to live and like feed yourself, but like look at our obesity numbers. Look at the lines that come out of like Chick-fil-A. Look at what people are consuming, like alcohol and all of that other nonsense. Which is like I guess I'm glad people are having like a good time, but like to what end? So no, I'm not glad that we're just doing that all the time at every given moment. Oh, life is hard. Time to pop this pill. Oh, life is really hard. I need to go get an 8-piece chicken nuggets. Oh, life is bad. It's time to go to Dunkin'. Like all of these sort of things. Oh, time to hit Grubhub because I don't want to leave my house. Like all of these things that can just happen at the drop of a hat. But 1984 gets a bad rap in that it literally is outlining an external force where I would, as I said, read it in a way that I take the big brother piece, the external totalitarianism, to the degree where we have so much freedom nowadays that we are censoring ourselves and we are forcing ourselves into this place where we are doing these things to distract ourselves from the real problems of the world or the stressors that we are dealing with in our own day-to-day lives. And that's the scariest part for me, is not that we have a Sleepy Joe or a big orange bad man. That person isn't the big brother. the big brother is like the people in your life that like are dealing with so much stress that they force you to not have the ability to do what you want. And then also the big brother is yourself. The big brother is how you are processing what you're going through on a day-to-day basis, and then you're forcing yourself to pick up your phone. I mean, we haven't even talked about social media or social media companies and how they are essentially pointing the and wielding the gun back at yourself through your phone. And the gun is your own distraction. The gun is you just burning time. You're burning your life away. As you mentioned, television. The combination of television and your phone is mortifying.
Yeah, yeah. I saw an article yesterday that highlighted that something like, what was it? It was a 42% of teens 13 to 18 are constantly on YouTube. Like, not like sometimes, like it's always open on their phone. Um,
What age group?
13 to 18, so just teenagers.
I mean, that checks out based on when I walk around the classroom.
Yeah, and so that, like, I don't know that they're as interested in like television or movies necessarily. I don't know, because like this was a very specific study that was just studying teen use of social media, and so it was disproportionate across the way for other platforms. So TikTok was like 20, between 20 and 25% were constantly on TikTok, and then it kept trailing off. So it was like Twitter was the next one, for people always using it, and then it was a little bit of Instagram and almost no one on Facebook. So it's like teens have stopped using Facebook, they're using Instagram less, they're using Twitter a little more than that, and then TikTok, a bunch of them are using, and YouTube, they're all, or half of them are using. And I just view YouTube and TikTok as being different forms of TV played out in smaller ways to make you feel like you're wasting less time, but it's inherently more addicting because, there's no way of breaking it up beyond the ads that you're watching.
Yeah, and that brings up another point, that anytime I show anything from YouTube in class, like my students know now that I just hate advertising and hate commercials because I like throw up a big stink when the ads come on, and I'm like, oh, not again. I hate this stuff because, like, time is valuable in the classroom, and when it's filled with chew strident, chew blah blah blah, you should go get some Febreze. It's just like, yeah, it's just cancer of the ear, cancer of the eye. It's harmful. And I see when we're using our phones, my phone is currently like in my hand, by the way. It's right here. When we have our phone, it's dividing our attention, and I see the division of our attention as the end. Like, I just see that as the first steps towards the end. Not to get all like tinfoily on us, but if we aren't able to look away from a screen long enough to listen to one another, then what else are we willing to do to betray the people we care about most? Not that it's necessarily a betrayal, but like not listening to someone you care about is harmful. Like not listening like fully, I see as harmful. And how many of us do it all the time?
Yeah, everyone listening to this, because this is predominantly going to be listened to on a mobile device.
Yeah. And like, I'm not saying that I'm perfect with this either. Like, You know how often I will like send an email on my phone, especially at work, because it's just so much easier than like opening my laptop. Most of the time, I'm like walking while sending an email on my phone because like it's right there. But if someone talks to me, then it's dividing my attention. But it kind of, I don't want to get too off topic with the phones, but it's kind of like it's like a self-fulfilling sort of prophecy with the phones. And on some level, there is like a level of pretension that our phones feed into ourselves, right? You customize your phone. Your phone is an extension of your personality. It's starting to become your personality. And the more you look at it, the more you are in love with yourself, especially the things you're looking at. Like if you're looking at social media, like you've curated, quote unquote, curated this like list. And that's what I'm saying is like you're pointing the gun back at yourself. It is the black mirror, right?
Yeah, so that's something Huxley actually just got completely wrong. A lot of the technology in Brave New World is stuff that humans have to adapt to use, where the society is sort of centered around the technology they've created. Whereas our technology is designed specifically to capture our attention. Like it's built for us. And the struggle is then like we're not necessarily trying to adapt to how to use it. We just exist in a space where it's imperfect and that causes people distress.
Hmm. That makes sense.
Like you mentioned the social dilemma, but the social dilemma, even though it kind of paints well, not even kind of, it just paints a very negative picture of social media companies and algorithm writers as being negligent for what they were making. Um, and it heavily implies that they're malicious because of what they did. But the real thing is not that they're necessarily malicious, it's just that they want your attention, and it's the inherent content on different social media platforms that keeps you there, not the algorithm of the platform itself. So the social media companies aren't necessarily the ones that are wrong as much as it is the content creators and then our own animalistic reptilian inability to disconnect from what we see because we get a strong reaction from it.
Yeah, I forget what the quote was, but it's something like our brains aren't designed to deal with technology of the gods. Like I forget what the quote is, but it's something like really, really awesome like that. And I just completely agree that we basically have the technology of the gods and we are not gods. Like we can't handle this. And so I'm saying like this is the first these are the first steps down the dark road. But I don't necessarily I don't really want to fuse with robots.
Yeah, it feels inevitable that we will.
It does.
I don't know that that's necessarily dark. This, like, it's weird to think about how like smartphones have really only been super popular for like 10 years, like 11 years is when they've really like hit the market where like everyone in the world kind of now has a phone, or like 80%, a lot of the all of the developed world does, and even a lot of underdeveloped parts of the world have access to phones.
Even though it feels like it's
um,
been 30 years, yeah.
but consider the impact that that's had on the few wars that have happened. Like there's the Russian invasion of Ukraine now, and that's one of the first wars where we're seeing a lot of it from cell phone footage. Like we're just seeing this constantly, violence happen on. Like you could, I don't really know what news outlets are covering it with, lots of graphic videos, but it's even harder to escape now than it was before, because it was groundbreaking and revolutionary, and it kind of turned the tide of the Vietnam War back in the 70s. Whenever they had journalists go and capture the video footage, and then it takes like a week to get to Vietnam to get set up, then it takes them a few months to shoot all the footage, then they compile it and they get it back. And it's like this long process just so there could be a 5-minute TV segment about war crimes that the American public got to see happen. Now it's like, if a city gets bombed, there's going to be videos of it while it's happening. Like, people are going to live stream it. There's going to be all kinds of videos up an hour or two after. And it's strange for us to, like, we're so removed from violence. Like, in America, at least, like, the only violence here is, criminal violence caused usually by, like, class rigidity or poverty or cops torturing, murdering people. But
it's just a traffic stop. It's fine. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, we can't get into the cops torturing and killing people because that's a whole. Oh boy, that's a can of worms.
Yeah, you and I have some. We probably agree completely on that, but I don't think we need to go down that road for this episode.
At any rate, my point was basically that I don't view our addiction to the phone as inherently going down a path we can't come back from, because in a weird way, its ability to show the world in its worst form is going to make us better in the long run. Our addiction to the phone is probably something that'll also go away in the long run, like, because we either get better at developing ways to stop ourselves from using it constantly, or because we'll have more and more young people who come into the world and look at everyone just staring down at their phone and don't like that and want to go a different direction.
Right, the pendulum swings back.
Yeah, or we're just in we've gone too far towards the transhumanism thing, and this is just step 3 of 18 of becoming part machine, part human.
Transhumanism, you mean that we are merging with machines, not transgenderism, right?
Yeah, transhumanism is the idea that humanity merges with machines. Yeah, it has nothing to do with any of that.
I know that. I'm just trying to make it clear for anyone who's listening, because you hear the word trans nowadays. Yeah,
trains. I like trains.
Same. So
transitioning to something else. Yeah, let's.
What I was going to say that you brought up is that one of the big things I see in 1984 as well as A Brave New World is this battle with oneself. Like, yes, both stories are to go into, like, from an English teacher perspective. Oh, what is the conflict of the story? What are the different conflicts here? Well, both of them clearly are human versus society, right? That's the easiest one to identify. But on a much deeper level, 1984 is all about the internal struggle and the internal strife that one deals with. And a chessboard is referenced throughout. And it takes center stage in the last chapter of the book, in that Winston is left drinking himself to death, and he's drinking himself into a stupor basically throughout the entire day. He is supplied alcohol by a waiter, and he sits and plays chess by himself. And it's heavily implied that he is basically like fighting a losing battle with himself, and he has lost. And the battle isn't between him and Big Brother. The battle is between he and himself, and it always has been. And that's like one of the biggest lessons that I think most people miss about the story. And that's one of the scariest things that I see every single freaking day, is the battle that you are fighting with yourself. Like, every day we're fighting a battle. What are you going to do today? Are you going to just F off and just like view a whole bunch of nonsense on your phone? Oh, well, I've worked really hard, so I deserve this little break. I need that little hit of Instagram. I need that little hit of whatever. Okay, that's fine. Like, I'm not saying that you're a demon for doing that. But like, the more that you feed into that, the more you're losing. And it's much easier to continue losing that battle over and over again, and to give into that inclination, or to give into those chess moves. Additionally, something else going along with the chessboard is the black and white thinking that's highlighted in 1984. You have the concept of doublethink, where people are thinking two contradictory things that are true at the same time. which on a much deeper level, actually in our world, is possible. That's called a paradox, right? If something is both this but also that, it is true that there are things like, obviously you get into moral and ethical arguments with that idea, but in 1984, doublethink is used as an explanation that the party gives for essentially psychologically manipulating people, where they tell you that they're at war with Oceania, or that they're at war with Eurasia, and then like the next month they're at war with East Asia, and they've never been at war with Eurasia. So they just constantly are flipping. There's a perpetual war. They're flipping back and forth between being at war with these super states, and the people are just supposed to accept it that that's true, even though they know that they were at war with the other person. And this happens quite often throughout the story, where it's proven that something is a fact, but then the people have to accept that the party's lie, is actually the truth. And when the party's lie passes in to be the truth, then it just is the truth. And
isn't that literally the end of the book? It's like a report on a war battle that they just won, but it's one that's different than what had been previously mentioned.
Yes, which is
like, it ends with them being like, we had a victory in Africa or something, and they're like, wait, weren't we at war with East Asia?
Yes, and Africa is actually, like, if you look at like sort of a map of what the territories are described as, it is disputed territory. So they're just like completely fabricating that, which also makes you wonder if there is really a war at all.
Yeah, my reading was always there just wasn't war.
That's my reading as well. And I leave. That book is really fun to teach because the students ask you a lot of questions, and I'm like, I don't know. I guess we'll have to see. They're like, what the hell is wrong with you? Why don't you just answer this question? But yeah, like, my reading is also that there isn't a war, despite there also being they do have like prisoners from the other side as well, but it's probably that they are finding like defectors from the other super states, and then they dress them up in fatigues or something like that. But something else with the doublethink is that there's a photograph of these three men, Jones, Aronson, and Rutherford, who they were, oh man, this is a little bit complicated, but basically they were in another location at the time, and there's a photograph of them in that location. But then Big Brother contradicts them being in that location at the time. And so then they are basically brought in and tortured and whatnot, and they are labeled as traitors of the party. They're reintegrated into society, and then they eventually are hanged publicly for their traitorous actions and their betrayal of the party. Now, this photograph is actually put in front of Winston, and he basically is being tested with it, and he does know that they existed, and he also knows the Big Brother is wrong, but he then throws it down the memory hole, which burns up the evidence, right? And this photograph is also used by O'Brien to then psychologically torture him again, and have him accept that the party is right and that Big Brother is right. But this continual denial of reality is a really wild concept, and something where he waves his fingers in front of Winston and asks him how many fingers he's holding up. And he doesn't wave them. He just puts them up, and he says, how many fingers am I holding up? He has 4 fingers up, and Winston actually sees 5 at a certain point. Like, he accepts that O'Brien is able to manipulate reality. There's another scene where O'Brien is talking about how if he wants to, he can convince Winston that he himself can fly. And if Winston believes that O'Brien is flying, then he is flying, which kind of reminds me of Infinite Jest with like the chairs and being able to sit on the chair that's in the air. But yeah, it's just like a really wild sort of like abstract philosophical idea that I find to both be like really fascinating and like really cool, but also just like so absolutely terrifying, because people do this. People are constantly like editing themselves, and they're editing their past. They're editing their history.
Yeah, so that was something I was kind of getting into earlier with like how I was trying to describe the way in which and I don't want to use the term like blanket term like the media, the way the media gets people to think. Um, but for simplicity's sake, I'll use the term media and not one specific type or another. Like literally all of it, the mainstream, the fringes, like most of it still operates on a binary. There's rarely a journalist who's unbiased and objective at really any of the levels. Um, but even more so, like each one always paints the enemy as being Big Brother. Like that's the part is they like the at least in the current political sphere, and it'll always shift and change to whatever people fear the most. But basically, the right's way of drumming up fear is by telling their audience that the left is rewriting history and that the 1619 project is evil because it eliminates the greatness of America, and that they scare all these southerners by removing their statues and destroying their monuments, and that's rewriting history and that's wrong, and we shouldn't do any of that because they want to replace it with their own weird whatever it ends up being, like pro-black history or pro-slave history or just anti-American history. um, Whereas the left plays to their audience by saying, we like look at what the right's doing. They ban this in schools. They ban that in schools. They write these books that just teach a completely different revisionist form of history. And both criticisms are rooted in reality. Um, like it is just fear mongering to a certain extent. I mean, obviously the details of that kind of get lost because there's a huge difference between like the 1619 project and like Texas's ability to ignore the nationwide standards for schooling and education and just rewriting history. Um, but that's I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole because that rabbit hole kind of is about like how do you rewrite history when the victors were wrong, and the victors are always wrong because we tend to just get more progressive as we go. I mean, the world is generally just more liberal. Like liberalism is bigger and better than it ever was, and it'll hypothetically continue to grow unless we just indefinitely backslide into dictatorships and authoritarian regimes. But I don't really want to get into a conversation about like revisionist history and whether or not we should tear down old statues of racist dudes who owned slaves or whatever.
What you just said made me think that like in 1984 there are the three super states. There's Oceania, Eurasia, and East Asia, and given the political parties and the spheres of information and the spheres of quote unquote truth telling that are happening based on the quote unquote media of each side, they are fear mongering and they're feeding into the hatred and the fear of both sides. And that in that case, I see both sides as having a big brother, and that big brother is doing all that it possibly can to keep us divided. If you have a divided population, if you have your population, basically, it's like, is there a war going on or not? Like, yeah, there is fighting that's happening in the war, but my point is that, like, if you're constantly feeding into that fear, then you can control them. It's much easier to control a population that's full of fear. I mean, I'm not saying anything new, like people know this, but it's easier to control a population that is afraid than is confident or like that has some level of transparency that they actually know what's going on. So like in that way, I see the super states, I see the left and the right as being both super states that are just continually being fed not lies, they're grounded in reality, but manipulated quote unquote facts, I guess, if you want to say it, but a manipulation with some end goal, yeah, some ulterior goal.
Yeah. Uh, well, on a totally different note, I think you'd mentioned it something earlier about um, the ending of 1984 and how people sort of interpret the ending wrong. Um, which reminds me of sort of the way I view the end of Brave New World, which is obviously depressing because, the one guy who's supposed to be the kind of the bridge between natural born people and uncivilized people versus the civilized engineered people. And, he hangs himself, unable to cope with either world. Like he's ostracized from both in opposite, strange ways. Um, but anyway, what I get out of the ending is essentially that what Huxley views as the problem in society is not that we can, not that we're unable to create a utopia. It's the idea that we inherently have the right to be unhappy and will always find something to be unhappy about. And therefore, we can never create a utopia in a world where we have free thought to be unhappy. And so I think that's kind of what the message of the book is like, you can't live in a perpetual state of happiness because it is the willingness to be unhappy and to find a flaw that allows us to improve over time. Maybe that is just the obvious ending and that is the way that people view it now. I don't know. I've talked about these books to very few people. There's been a lot written about them, a lot of, I don't know if there's one universal accepted truth.
I mean, I see it as that. Even if a book that I read is like extremely depressing, I usually, maybe it's just my own optimism, but I usually try to like figure out, okay, what's something else that I can get from it other than just like, holy shit, this is dark. So like, because of that concept, that's my reading of the ending as well. Like I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that.
So I will say, I like Brave New World more. Like it's just the type of book I like more. I don't know if it's Huxley's pacing or his language, like prose choice. Um, and I think the outcome, I still think the outcome of Brave New World is going to be a more accurate predictor of the future still to come than 1984. But with that being said, I think 1984 is a better story. And I like the story more, and in general, I like the characters more. Um, and because of that, I think I like a lot of content that is more based off of 1984, not Brave New World.
If I could add my take to this, yeah, I find the jumping around of location in A Brave New World to be rather jarring at times. We talked offline about how, well, I listened on tape actually to, I believe it was like a quarter or half of A Brave New World, which for me is like a real problem because I don't really do well with listening to books on tape. I just can't like keep track of them as well as just reading them for some reason. But I really like the prose of A Brave New World. The diction is awesome. It's just like so satisfying to read. The language that is used as well as the language that was created for the text is really cool and fun to read. Sort of in a similar way to A Clockwork Orange, just not as wild and like meta, I guess. But the story itself is fine. But I really enjoy the mechanisms of control that are used in A Brave New World. Not necessarily more than 1984. I just think they really speak to Huxley's intellect, like being able to cook this up and sort of like weigh these out, whereas 1984 is much more I'm failing with words here, but it's more like tactile, and it's much easier to imagine how this would take shape. Sort of like these these engines, these factories that Orwell has cooked up. Like it just makes more sense. So I'm basically just saying that, like, I don't want to trash Orwell here, but I think it's easier sort of to come up with the idea for 1984 than it is A Brave New World, if that makes any sense. Like, I see A Brave New World as a much more creative endeavor in some ways, whereas 1984 is more manufactured. Like, it's more of like a painstaking process. But I could just be completely wrong. Like, I think I might just be talking about the way that they think about things. And I admire Huxley's creative language more than Orwell's. More than Orwell's. I also don't really enjoy how long and dense 1984 is. Like, it is rather redundant in certain parts, which I think says more about the fact that he was basically on his deathbed in the final stages of writing this and editing it. But with that being said, the ideas in there are long lasting and more relevant, obviously, now than ever before. But yeah, I find the characters to be more interesting in 1984 as well. I do really like John, though, and it's really hard to not identify with him in A Brave New World.
Oh, yeah, I mean, you're supposed to. Because, like, the original protagonist we get introduced to, Bernard, is like his flaws are pathetic. Like, he's pathetic inherently. Like, his, because he feels so inferior, like, he's, like, literally made not to be an alpha male. And so that, like, with that driving him, you don't want to be him, even though you may be him. And so by the time you meet John, and John is just, like, you know, a child in a way, but also oddly sophisticated. But his understanding of the failings of both the natural world he was a part of and the manufactured world that he gets pushed into, I think are more understandable than Bernard. John also feels more like a messianic figure than Bernard, who's just kind of like a self-serving bastard.
Definitely. Absolutely. Winston from we haven't really talked like at all about the character of Winston, but the way I see him is sort of like an everyman, but then also he obviously he is someone who, like, part of his nature is to rebel. Like, when he is controlled, there's no way he can stifle his want and desire to not be controlled. So, like, at the end of the story, as I said, O'Brien calls him like a special case because Winston consciously wants to love Big Brother, but he unconsciously can't. So they have to just destroy him through him betraying Julia by saying that he wants them to do what they're about to do to him with rats eating his face, which they never actually have do. And it's somewhat implied they may have actually done to Julia, or they did. They obviously were torturing her, but they did something which was her worst fear. I wanted to read this one piece that I actually came up with. I believe this was a year ago in one of my classes where I was talking with them about some of the themes of the story, and then we put them into a thesis. And this is one of the best theses that I read. To be clear, this is me writing based on their ideas in class live. So like we talked about the themes, and then I like rephrased them for the students to have like a thesis. So totalitarian governments eliminate opposing ideas, resulting in the lack of independent thinking and action, thus eradicating the human condition. That's what I see 1984 as.
Say that again?
Totalitarian governments eliminate opposing ideas, resulting in the lack of independent thinking and action, thus eradicating the human condition.
Yeah, I'd say that's a good descriptor of 1984.
Whereas A Brave New World is just using the human condition against oneself. Like sort of allowing the virus to spread. Not that humans are viruses, but like our inclination is to just press the pleasure button. And what's stopping you from doing that?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately that becomes like, I think that's like of the Postman quote and the Hitchens quote, like I think that is fundamentally the distillation of their points and the larger argument between 1984 and Brave New World in terms of accuracy or longevity of one authoritarian over the other, is whether or not it's easier to control people by giving them exactly what they want all the time, or by slowly depriving them more and more.
Yeah, until they have nothing left to deprive them of.
And then they revolt every time.
Unless they don't have the capability of revolting, yeah. But
like my ultimate point is every time that a system like this has existed in the world, the problem has always become they just stop feeding the people after a while. Like they just forget that they need to give the populace food, and then they just kill everyone in charge.
Yeah. Yeah, and the way that 1984 explains that away is that like, oh well, we're working on the rations right now, so we've got the chocolate rations. So those chocolate rations you can only get one, whatever, every week. Which yeah, it's much more realistic that people would revolt, but it would be really hard to maintain that system of 1984. But yeah, I mean, my biggest criticism of the book is that it is a little bit too dense.
Yeah, whereas I think my biggest criticism of Brave New World is that it gets a little too like fluttery at parts. Like it gets a little too romantic.
Yeah,
like, I didn't even mention the what's his name, Hembolt. Helmholtz Watson. He's like Bernard's best friend, and he's a writer. And they have a bunch of conversations about like conforming to society and free will.
Oh yeah, that dude is just Huxleyan.
Yeah, and he ultimately gets exiled by the government, but he's happy because he's like, I hate this place. I want to go live with the people who got exiled because they're going to be more like me anyway. So he gets what he wants. But there's a whole lot of stuff with him of like this just masturbatory things of like just poems Huxley wrote that he wanted to shoehorn into a novel somewhere, and
Yeah, I'm gonna have to try to
like
not
meta.
do that in my dystopia.
I mean, it still works because they're great poems. So ultimately, it doesn't really matter. Um, so I don't necessarily have too much more to say conversationally between these two. Um, I know we haven't gone over everything, um, but I did want to get to just some like random notes I put together while going back over these books. Most of them are actually about 1984. Um, so one of them was seeing how the ending of 1984, like I kind of put it as like a similarity between the end of The Conformist and the end of Doctor Strangelove. Like just in terms of relating, media and content I really like back onto something older. Uh, like I view the end of 1984 as being exactly a synthesis between The Conformist and Doctor Strangelove.
Hmm.
Where like he's clearly not happy. Um, but at the same time he is, because he's grown to finally accept the thing he cannot change, even though it's horrifying.
I wouldn't even say grow. He's forced to, but
Right.
but but yeah.
I also just have V for Vendetta written down. Nothing written next to it, just V for Vendetta.
Yeah, V for Vendetta doesn't exist without 1984.
It's just like a more stylized, actiony version of 1984, but with the happy ending.
Yeah, I was gonna say with not just a super depressing end.
Yeah, and obviously the power of that story. I assume people still like the movie and probably the graphic novel, but I think the power comes from the fact that there is a messianic figure whose sacrifice is meaningful, whereas there's nothing like that in 1984.
No.
Because everything, like every opposition to the party and to Big Brother, is a fabrication of Big Brother and the party.
Exactly.
So there isn't even room for him because the government already made up V. And they made him up so they could catch people who were already committing thought crimes, so they could trap them later. And then the last one I have written down is Brazil, the Terry Gilliam movie.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
Um,
I absolutely love that movie so much.
Yeah, so what I wrote was Brazil is the finest adaptation I've seen of the novel, putting the entire Orwellian nightmare through a Kafkaesque lens.
Yes. Yeah. Anyone who wants to like that, I actually haven't seen the movie 1984. At some point I'll probably watch it. It's hard to watch it's hard to watch a movie that just has such depth of text like 1984. Yeah, I don't know. I just feel like I'll watch it and just come away feeling like there are huge gaps that are missing. But I should probably give it a chance. It's got John Hurt as Winston, I believe. But yeah, back to Brazil. Brazil, for anyone who hasn't seen Brazil and you're older than 16, I would recommend watching it. Yeah. If you'd like to like really make yourself think and consider what it is that you are doing with your life and what other people are doing with your life, it will really rip the rug out from under you. I see it as a much better, not better version of Blade Runner, but like it's like a cousin of Blade Runner, not a brother of Blade Runner, but I think it's better.
Oh, I don't even think it's close. Yeah, I think Brazil is just like far and away the best portrayal of like a dystopian, futuristic nightmare that accurately describes the humdum tedium of bureaucracy. Like it just nails like that Kafka feeling perfectly.
I remember reading the definition of bureaucracy in like high school or something like that. And I was just like, trying to like imagine this. And I remember watching Brazil and like being taken back to when I was reading what a bureaucracy was. And I was just like, oh my God. All right. Yeah. It just really puts it all into a terrifying perspective. And it's one of the reasons why I get so worked up over bureaucratic nonsense. It's because I've seen that movie, which is why you should go and watch that movie.
Yeah, I'm sure at some point we'll have a long discussion about Terry Gilliam, um, and his form of art in general. But Brazil is definitely like the high water mark for him, both because he wrote it and because he directed it. But yeah, just a brilliant movie and a great version of 1984. I think it came out in like 85, like right after.
Yes, it did. I'm almost positive it came out in 85.
I think it was probably slated to come out in 84, but because Terry Gilliam's entire career is defined by um, various movie studios messing with him, it probably got delayed to the next year, thus robbing him of, a more funny historical coincidence.
I just have one final message, I guess, on all of these ideas, but that's black and white thinking and the chessboard. Whether or not you like chess, whether or not you identify with chess, black and white thinking is very dangerous by separating ideas into like good or bad and separating people into good or bad, or separating things down into this dichotomy, like not thinking about things on a spectrum or not even just like considering things in like an abstract way is very, very problematic, I would say. And one has to fight our societal urges and the ways that we've been told that, oh, this person is bad, or that person is bad, or this person is good. I make the case that if you are labeling people as bad, then you're not giving them a chance to redeem themselves. Obviously, there are people that have done things that are like egregious, over the line. I'm not saying that those people need to be forgiven. That's not the case I'm making. But I'm talking about someone who cuts you in the lunch line or something like that, or cuts you off in the highway, something like that, what have you.
Not someone who cuts off your hand.
No, not that. Yeah. But also, like, if you label someone as good in your mind, then, or like a hero, right? There's that quote that one shouldn't meet one's heroes. It's like putting them on a pedestal, and then when they do make a mistake or they commit a folly, then your world is shattered. Your reality is broken down. So like it's just not actually seeing the world in realistic ways. If you're thinking in black and white, you're just not seeing the world for what it is. Obviously, I hate to use the analogy that like you're not seeing color, but you aren't. You're not seeing the space in between. You're not seeing the beauty. You're not seeing the folly. You're not seeing the problems, the good, what have you, what's out there, right? And then the last point is just you have to win the battle over yourself with whatever it is that you want to do. And ultimately, if society is telling you to not do what you want to do, or if it's bringing you down or what have you, or there are people in your life that are holding you back, you have to win that battle by convincing yourself that it's worth it. And ultimately, that's something that I take to heart, and that's something that I try to project to my students. And that's something that I get from both of these stories, is that you could both give in to the pleasures that the world offers and just distract yourself, or you could succumb to the pressures of the wild system that you're working inside of. You could succumb to your own your own control that you're putting on yourself and not allowing yourself to do what you actually want to do. So you have to find that straddle between the two and ultimately decide for yourself and be your own person, as you said, the individual. And that's not to say that you have to go move to a cabin in the woods, but you need to figure out what your place is that you can actually explore on your own and do your own thing.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that.
All right. we hope you enjoyed this episode. I know this has been a long time coming, and we look forward to doing more book discussions, because we certainly don't want them to be reviews. We don't really want to get in the habit of like, oh, there's just a 4.75 out of whatever. We've talked about that before, but we'd like them to be more organic. We do come prepared to talk. We have talking points. We did research. I mean, we have read these and we've discussed them to great lengths already, but this was really, really fun.
Yeah, as a total, just not related to this at all. Like I'm sure in the future we'll do something with rating, like numerical rating, or something with tier lists, like the generic way that people talk about media, like just through podcasts or YouTube or.
I'd rather give awards. I'd rather give awards that are ironic or not ironic, like unironic awards or ironic. So like, yeah, the tiered list. But
yeah, so that's more so what I would lean towards is tiers, where you're inventing the tiers and it's not just like this is the creme de la creme versus this is garbage.
Right, this belongs in the flaming toilet, and we just have on screen a flaming toilet of us just throwing basketballs of like the movie or the book into the flaming garbage, whatever it is.
That'll be our first visual episode, is one where I have an actual disconnected commode with a lit fire in the bottom. Where I'm putting
you and I are in a field and we're dumping.
We're just burning books.
Oh man, let's do it. Live action Fahrenheit 451. All right, everyone.
Hi, I'm Guy Montag, and I'm here to burn books.
All right, everyone. Hope you enjoyed this. Take care. We'll see you later.